so much for joining me today. We are getting ready to start our study of the Gospel of John. And I'm very excited because we're going to get to spend all the way through the end of May in this Gospel. And so we're going to be spending 2 quarters of our Sunday school curriculum focused on John. And this is going to allow us to dive in pretty deeply. And it's also going to allow us to go almost verse by verse through most of the book. And so I'm very excited that we get to have this time to do a deep dive. Now, disclaimer, John is probably my favorite gospel if I had to pick. I really do love reading John. I love the portrait he paints of Jesus and just the unique approach he takes. And we're going to talk about some of those unique things. So I thought that since we're going to be spending so much time focused on this one book, that it would be helpful if we had an introduction that kind of gave us an overview of what to expect as we approach this gospel. One thing I think it's helpful to keep in mind as we approach the study of any gospel, not just John, is to try our hardest to keep ourselves from bringing in information from the other gospels, but to focus specifically on that one gospel and the portrait that the writer paints of Jesus from that one place. I think it's very, very often whenever we come to scripture, especially when we come to the gospels, we will spend a lot of time trying to harmonize and say, well, this story and that story, and they fit together this way. And these writers talk about the same things. And so this is how it fits together. And so our portrait of Jesus is kind of brought together from different gospel writers. And it should be that way to an extent. But I think when we're approaching the study of a book, one of the gospels in detail like we're going to, I want us to challenge us to try to see what is the portrait that John specifically is painting of Jesus. So when we think about each gospel and each gospel writer, they each paint us a unique portrait of Jesus. Just as if you were to have 4 different artists painting a picture of the same historical figure, they would each have a unique perspective. Or even if you took an artist and they painted the same historical figure at different points in that figure's life or doing different activities, you're going to have each one of the portraits are going to be slightly different, but they're of the same person. So we have 4 different writers presenting their portraits of Jesus. And I think it's very helpful for us as we dive into this study to remember that John has a unique approach, a unique purpose, and a unique portrait that he's going to paint of Jesus. And so I want to challenge us to see if we can bring that together and see what that portrait is. So the Gospel of John, it is definitely a very unique gospel. It really just has a different feel as you read through it. And the thing is very interesting because each one of the Gospels has its own unique style and feel, but John just seems to be set apart from the other 3. And one of the things I think is very helpful, there's this book and it's called 4 Gospels, 1 Jesus, and it's written by Richard Burridge. And he takes these different images that have been historically associated with each of the Gospels. So back in the medieval ages, whenever scribes were copying the Gospels down, and they would make illuminated manuscripts where there would be these very ornate drawings in and around the text itself. But they weren't just doodles. They were very ornate and very complex and very beautiful. And they would decorate the Gospels with different images. And so these images kind of became associated with the different Gospels. So, for instance, the Gospel of Mark is often associated with the image of a lion because Mark presents Jesus as kind of bursting onto the scene and he starts right in the middle of things at Jesus' baptism. Or the Gospel of Luke is often associated with an ox, and Jesus is the bearer of burdens. And Matthew is often associated with the image of a human. And then finally we come to John, and John is associated with the image of an eagle. And specifically this idea of a high-flying eagle. We think about eagles, they fly very high, they have very good vision. Burridge also pointed out that the portion of an eagle's brain that is devoted to sight is 7 times greater than humans. I just thought that was very interesting. So they are known for being far-sighted. In fact, C.S. Lewis named one of his characters in The Last Battle, the last book of the Chronicles of Narnia, Farsight. He was an eagle, and he would fly above everything and see everything that was going on all at once. And eagles are also known for having great speed. And so this image of an eagle is often associated with the Gospel of John. One of the biggest reasons is because John is often considered is often called the spiritual gospel. So we get a lot of rich theology, deep theology, especially in the prologue. John puts a good amount of emphasis on Jesus' divinity, and we will also see that in the prologue and as we go throughout the whole book. So this idea of Jesus coming from above, and he is fully divine, but he's also fully human, and really wrestling with that. This idea of being this high-flying eagle kind of over and above everything. It's very interesting when we kind of start to put an image to it that way. So as you read through John, I encourage you to look at ways that you see that image fitting and also maybe where it doesn't. So the Gospel of John is most often in church tradition associated with the Apostle John. So the church tradition, so church history holds that John the Apostle was the one who wrote it. But the author of John is never named in the book. In fact, the only information we have, if we were to flip to John 21 really quickly, all the way to the end, this is the last chapter, and look at verse 20. It says, Peter turned. So Jesus has been talking to Peter. This is when he's reinstating Peter. And it says that, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who's going to betray you? So let's put a ... and let's skip down to verse 24. It says, this is the disciple. So this person, this beloved disciple, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. When he goes on to say, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose not even the whole world would have room for the books that would be written. So the only identification we get in the Gospel of John is that it was written by this beloved disciple. And we are not really told who it is. We can make some assumptions about who it isn't. It's not Peter, but by who else is named in the story. But we are not told specifically. But church tradition has held that the beloved disciple is in fact the Apostle John. So the Gospel of John would have been written down somewhere between 70 to 100 AD, maybe even as early as 60 to 65, depending on how you date different things. But so that's about the time would have been written down. We know about the time that John died, so that's why we were able to kind of put a good date to when it was probably written down. We also have some very early fragments, pieces of the gospel that had been, so it obviously been circulated, that are dated to about 125 AD. So we know it would have needed time to circulate. So probably by 100, it would have had to have been written down. So when I say really old church tradition, I'm talking about early church figures who mentioned John, who mentioned his gospel. And so if you want to read about it, I'll give you a couple names. Look up Polycarp, look up Irenaeus, and look up about what they had to say about John. Polycarp is said to have been tutored by John, to have been taught by him in some way. He knew him at the very least. He was the bishop of Smyrna and was just kind of interesting in general. So church tradition holds that John wrote it while he was in Ephesus, and that there was a community there that had grown up around hearing his teachings. So now that we know who and we know when, let's talk about how John structured his gospel. So if we look at the very beginning, we see that John starts uniquely, and we'll dive a little bit more into the unique way he starts whenever we talk about the first 18 verses, so the prologue. But I want to talk about our overall structure. So it starts with a prologue, and that's the first 18 verses. And then we can really divide the book of John into two books or two sections. So you have the book of signs, which is kind of part one, and it starts in chapter 1, verse 19, and it goes through chapter 10. Chapter 10 is the conversation about Jesus as the Good Shepherd, and then some other different conversations, and it stops right before the death of Lazarus. And then there is the book of glory, and that really picks up in chapter 13. And so that's where the foot washing starts. So that the book of glory, so part 2 is there. 11 and 12 are kind of this interlude. And so 11, you have the death of Lazarus, and then Jesus goes and he raises Lazarus from the dead. And then the Pharisees are getting really upset. And Jesus is anointed at Bethany in chapter 12. And so then he comes into Jerusalem, triumphant entry. So those kind of serve as like an interlude. And then 13 picks up the story of the foot washing. And from 13 through 20, we have the book of glory. And this is going to focus specifically on Jesus' passion. So his crucifixion and his resurrection. And so that's what we see there. Chapter 21 functions as an epilogue and kind of wraps up the book that way. And we have that information I shared with you about the beloved disciple being the author of this book, and kind of closes everything up with a bow for the most part. And so I think it's very helpful when we start to think about it that way, and we think about Jesus demonstrating who he is, so the book of the signs, and then so we have this revelation. Who is Jesus? He is, he's the one who's coming. John's going to introduce that in the prologue. Then we have Jesus coming and introducing who he is. And we have all of these different signs. So the wedding at Cana, and he turns the water into wine. And he talks to the woman at the well. And he talks to Nicodemus and the woman at the well, all of those different things. And it's just one thing after another where he's demonstrating who he is. And then the book of glory that's going to really detail why he came. So the idea of redemption and how that is going to just transform everything. And so the book of glory. So some other interesting things about this gospel. I've said it's very unique. John does contain some stories that are very much well loved, but John is the only one who records it. So Nicodemus would be a very good example. He is the only one who records Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, or with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And another one is the story of Lazarus and how Jesus raised him from the dead. And so some of those stories, there's more. They're unique to John's gospel. And there's some other ones. It's very interesting if you go and look at what is unique to John's gospel. The other thing that is unique is the reason we have this idea of Jesus having 3 years of ministry. It is from the Gospel of John. If we based that chronology on the other 3 Gospels, we would only have about a year of ministry. But in the Gospel of John, we see Jesus going through that cycle of going up to Jerusalem 3 different times for the Passover. So remember, Jews would travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And so we see him do that 3 separate times in the Gospel. And that's where we get that 3 years of ministry that Jesus did while he's here on earth. So I mentioned it's important for us to consider why each gospel writer included what they included, or wrote what they wrote the way that they did. And John gives us a clearer picture of his purpose. If we want to look at John 20, look down at verse 31. And it says, in my Bible, the heading above 30 says the purpose of John's gospel. So let's read starting in verse 30. So 20, verse 30. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So he wrote because he wants to communicate that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's the purpose. Why did John write what he wrote? Well, he wanted others to know about who Jesus is. Who is this Jesus? And why is he important? Why do we need to read about him? Why do we need to learn about him? Why do we need to believe in him? That's why he wrote it. That's why he recorded what he recorded. As we read through John's gospel, we can tie everything back to this central theme of Jesus, God in flesh, appearing in human history. And then also to the central purpose, but that others may believe in him as well. Some other things that John presents and things to look for. There are lots of contrasts in John's gospel. If we were to look at the very beginning, we see a lot of light and dark imagery. There's other contrasts that we'll see throughout. Contrast between life and death, contrast between belief and unbelief, and there's others. I encourage you just kind of dig for yourself and see what you see what you can find. And so we see contrast. We also see this idea of misunderstanding. So we have this high-flying Jesus who is presenting these very in-depth spiritual realities using very mundane human language. We see Nicodemus completely misunderstand what Jesus is communicating whenever he's talking about being born again. And Nicodemus is so confused about how in the world is that possible. And we see the woman at the well being very confused about the living water and how she's just not quite understanding it until Jesus explains it further. And so we see misunderstandings happen over and over again. Obviously, you see the Pharisees misunderstand quite a lot. John's Gospel also presents quite a bit of information on the Holy Spirit, and we'll see that kind of woven throughout. And honestly, I could talk all day about all of the different things that we see in John's Gospel, but that is why we have all of these months to do it together. I hope this introduction has been helpful for you. I've certainly enjoyed doing a bit of a deeper dive on an overview of John. I hope you'll join me in the next video. We're going to be discussing the prologue of John. So John 1:1 through 18. I'll talk to you then. Bye.